The Mongol Empire, initially a collection of often quarreling tribes, scattered across the Mongolian steppes, transformed under the leadership of Chinggis Khan, whom we know as Genghis Khan. By 1206, it had become a unified force. Although Genghis Khan passed away in 1227, his descendants continued to expand and solidify his territories. One of them, his grandson Kublai Khan, pushed the empire to its greatest geographical reach. The Mongol Empire achieved its growth through remarkable military successes, overwhelming kingdoms in every direction. With the speed and power of their mounted warriors, the Mongols' unmatched ferocity and mobility allowed them to dominate like no other power before them. Their mobility stemmed from their nomadic lifestyle on the steppes. While their horses weren't particularly fast, each Mongol rider typically had several horses and would switch between them, allowing the animals to rest. This allowed them to cover impressive distances, up to 160 kilometers or 100 miles a day. Consequently, they could strike quickly and unexpectedly, appearing like a distant storm on the horizon one moment, and then a destructive force directly overhead the next. However, alongside their triumphs, the Mongols also faced some notable setbacks. One such failure was their attempt to conquer the small, isolated island nation of Japan. They directed the winds of war towards Japan, but Japan responded with a defiant storm of its own. The Japanese had largely avoided direct contact and conflict with the Mongol Empire, maintaining no official diplomatic relations with either of their immediate neighbors, China or Korea. Beyond trade and occasional raids, they primarily kept to themselves and their own affairs. The Mongols, however, had heard of Japan as a land abundant in gold. Marco Polo had written about Japan, stating, "The people on the island of Zipangu have limitless quantities of gold. The king's palace is roofed with pure gold, and the floors are paved in gold, 2 fingers thick." This account was likely familiar to the Khan, as Japan's reputation as a gold producer was well known to Chinese rulers. Historical records indicate that previous delegations from China in earlier centuries had returned with substantial amounts of gold. These accounts and others contributed to the perception of Japan as a land of gold, even though it was, in reality, more of a land of silver. The Khan may have also had more personal motivations for the invasion. In 1266, Kublai Khan sent 2 envoys to Japan with a letter proposing the establishment of friendly relations between the 2 countries. However, certain statements in the letter, while perhaps customary for the Mongols, were viewed as insulting by the Japanese. One example was the reference to their emperor as a mere king, and another was the veiled suggestion that Japan should become a tributary vassal state. Perhaps the most offensive aspect was the final paragraph, which seemed to imply a threat of war if Japan did not comply. As a result of this initial contact, the envoys returned empty-handed, as did a second group of envoys in 1268, and additional envoys sent in 1269, 1271, and 1272, who were not even permitted to land on Japanese shores. Since the late 1100s, Japan had been governed by a military dictatorship based in Kamakura, under the control of the Hojo clan. The emperor, whose court was located in Kyoto, functioned primarily as a figurehead. Emperor Kamiyama's chamberlain issued an edict stating that a Ninoi curse would be invoked against the Mongols. This, combined with a later tsunami, would form the basis for future legends surrounding the divine protection of Japan. The Japanese culture continued to blend divinity with nature, as it had since its animistic past. Even under the influence of Buddhism and Shintoism, the samurai were also compared to cherry blossoms, as their lives, while glorious, were prone to a sudden end during military service, much like the petals shed by cherry blossoms. As mentioned earlier, the true power in Japan resided with the Kamakura shogunate, technically under the shogun, but in reality, its de facto leader was Hojo Tokimune, who had inherited the title as the 6th reigning Hojo Shikken, or regent, from his father in 1256 due to his father's declining health. Neither the Khan nor the Hojo would directly participate in the fighting that was to come. The two armies differed significantly in appearance, tactics, and armaments. While both took pride in their horseback archers, their approaches were very different. The samurai firing arrows on horseback were heavily armored in the 13th century, and they rode smaller horses than the Mongols did. While the Mongols also had heavy cavalry, their archers tended to be organized in a looser formation than their Japanese counterparts, and they were more like light cavalry armor-wise. The Mongols would unleash volleys of their relatively shorter arrows from their ranks, while the Japanese method was to send a single arrow against a chosen, hopefully worthy opponent, to earn honor and glory on the battlefield. The tactical formation of the Japanese was more warband-oriented, with each warband led by a prominent samurai and his followers. As mentioned, the Japanese would traditionally send a single arrow with a special signaling tip that would whistle as it flew to initiate combat. The Mongols, meanwhile, fought with a more rank-and-file structure, often using drums to signal battlefield maneuvers. They also had access to Chinese inventions, such as exploding grenade-like bombs made of both paper and iron, and delivered by catapults. These were among the first examples of gunpowder explosions heard in Japan. Samurai arms and armor consisted of the following. The armor was called yoroi, and it was made from small scales tied together and lacquered, then combined into armor plates by binding them together with silk or leather cord. This created a flexible defensive armor, capable of absorbing the high-impact energy of enemy blows. Both iron and leather were used, as a fully iron suit was deemed too heavy. Thus, iron was used for the most protective portions of the armor. The body of the yoroi armor consisted of 4 main sections, 2 large shoulder plates fastened at the back by a large ornamental bow, with 2 guards to protect the tying cords from being cut. Then the arm sections that provided free movement while keeping the body covered. Next was the helmet made from iron plates, fastened together with large projecting conical rivets, with the neck protected via a heavy 5-piece neck guard. Some samurai would also wear face masks. Generally, the shooting arm was kept armor-free to more easily allow arrows to be fired quickly and efficiently. Each samurai would also have a sword forged by a celebrated master, and it was one of the most prized gifts that a samurai could receive from a leader. These swords were almost reaching their zenith of perfection by the time of the Mongol invasions. Their long, curved blades were razor-sharp and could cut deeply into the brigandine-like coats of enemies like the Mongols. Lastly, the Japanese bow was longer, made out of deciduous wood, and backed with bamboo for added reinforcement. They were lacquered to weatherproof them and used bamboo arrows. On horseback, the bow was held high to the head to clear the horse, with the drawing hand pulled back to the ear. In contrast, the Mongol army, while often said to have been lightly armored, was in fact very diverse. While the common soldiers and horseback archers were more lightly armored, the Mongols also had contingents of heavy cavalry units, as depicted in the Japanese Mongol invasion scrolls. The lighter armor worn by those lighter units formed the foundation for all units, including the heavier armored ones. It was a heavy coat fastened by a leather belt at the waist, which also carried the sword, dagger, and sometimes even an axe. Boots were stout, but comfortable, and made from felt and leather. The head was covered in a hat made of felt and fur. The heavier armored units had over top of this a coat made in the Asiatic style of lamella armor, which consisted of small scales of iron or leather, or a combination of both, pierced with holes and sewn together via leather thongs. They wore helmets made from a number of large iron pieces, shaped roughly into a conical shape, and featured iron-plated neck guards much like the samurai armor. The heavy cavalry horses would likewise be protected by lamella armor. Their bows were shorter than the Japanese ones. They were composite reflex bows, a design made from yak horn, sinew, and bamboo glued together into a single set piece. The bow was strung against the natural curve, giving it an exceptionally strong pull. Each archer typically carried multiple bows and a quiver, with both regular and poison-tipped arrows. They also carried rounded wooden shields for personal protection, and their swords were slightly curved and saber-like in design. By 1271, the Mongols had dealt successive blows to the Chinese Song dynasty south of the growing Mongol Empire. The impact of this was the symbolic transition of the Mongol Empire from nomadic dwellers in tents to the more sedentary rulers of a civilized state. The Mongols had crept even closer to Japan by initiating an invasion of Korea in the year 1231. Despite valiant efforts by both its military and civilians, the Mongol attacks were relentless. There were moments of peace, but over the decades, the Mongols would send in wave after wave, and eventually, by 1259, the Koreans, battle-weary, capitulated. By the year 1273, the Mongols had unified their Korean invasion by marrying themselves into the Korean royal family. They would now have two separate coastal areas from which to launch an invasion against Japan. Numbers for the invasion fleet and the Japanese defenders for the first invasion attempt vary wildly. The likely numbers for the Mongol expedition force were likely 30,000 strong with hundreds of ships. The Japanese force, based on the number of samurai warbands and the average number in each, indicates that their force likely numbered between 4,000 and 8,000. This would indicate a ratio of Mongol to Japanese of roughly 6-1. The invasion fleet set sail on the 2nd of November 1274 from the southern end of the Korean peninsula. They first reached the island of Tsushima, which is featured in the video game Ghost of Tsushima. The island consisted of two main islands separated by a narrow strait. The Mongols would use a two-pronged assault, hitting both islands via 4 places on its western coast. Each island was attacked at 2 spots, with the main bulk of their force hitting the southern island at Sasura. Their vessels were spotted by islanders on the evening of the 4th of November. This provided the island's deputy Jito, a man by the name of So Sukakuni, with some time to hastily assemble a defense. The Japanese were superstitious in the sense that they believed in kami, or spirits, and omens. On the day the Mongols approached, a shrine dedicated to Hachiman, the god of war, caught on fire. While the fire was quickly extinguished, supposedly as messengers were to deliver news of this as a bad omen. Just then, a flock of white doves landed upon the shrine's roof, and it was then instead interpreted as a warning, not as a disaster. Sukakuni's command consisted of 80 mounted samurai warriors and their followers. He led them over a mountain pass at night to take up positions near the Mongol main assault landing force at Sasura. It must have been a tense wait for dawn. Dawn, however, would not arrive before the Mongols. At roughly 2 a.m., they landed, and intense, ferocious fighting broke out. At 4 a.m., Sukakuni had taken an interpreter along to see if discourse with the Mongols was possible, but it was not, as the Mongol reply would be a volley of arrows fired overhead, as 1,000 of their warriors from the beachhead charged the Japanese. Sukakuni had his samurai return fire, and their precision archery managed to kill many of the Mongols, but they still charged. As the fighting raged on the beaches, 2 Japanese boats managed to slip through the Mongol fleet to take a message to the rest of the Japanese islands that the war had started. Saito Sukesada, one of Sukakuni's closest men, had enthusiastically attacked and killed a high-ranking senior Mongol officer who, along with his group, had gotten stuck in a grove of beachside trees. The Mongols returned fire at him, first with a stone-hurling catapult, then with a volley of arrows, 3 of which pierced deeply into his chest. Half of Sukakuni's followers would die from the overwhelming Mongol numbers, but even as their number dropped below half, and then a quarter, they fought on bravely until all, including Sukakuni, were dead. The Mongols would set fire to every building in the vicinity and slaughter most of the inhabitants. They would spend another 9 days securing the island before leaving to head for the smaller island of Iki to the south. On the 13th of November, the deputy Jito there a man by the name of Taira Kagetaka, was said to have hailed from the family by the same name that was defeated during the Genpei War. Kagetaka had received word of the coming Mongols while he was at his castle headquarters. He immediately sent urgent word to Dazaifu on the main southern island of Japan for reinforcements. Kagetaka and his followers fought similarly on the beaches when the Mongols landed. They had arrived later in the day, so despite losing half his men, the Mongols would retreat back to their ships at nightfall, giving Kagetaka and his men some reprieve, so he ordered what was left of them back to his castle. In the castle, they hoped to hold out and protect the women and children until mainland reinforcements could come by morning, though they were surrounded by the full landing force and their red-bannered warships. The Japanese women would take up arms in an attempt to bolster the defense, but the Mongols shattered the castle's front gate, and with no relief forces having arrived to assist, Kagetaka prepared to lead his men out with a final arrow assault and charge. However, when they arrived in the open courtyard, hundreds of their fellow countrymen from the surrounding villages had been tied up into a human shield. In response, some of the Japanese dropped their bows, unsheathed their swords, and charged at the Mongols. Although they were said to have fought valiantly, the Mongols overwhelmed them, and Kagetaka and his family, and most of his senior men, would commit ritual suicide. All would be slaughtered save one, Kagetaka's daughter, whom he had sent to Dazaifu with one of his trusted samurai the day before. The Mongols would next turn their attention towards the main Japanese islands. The Japanese at the regional seat of government in Dazaifu had already been alerted by messengers of the events in Tsushima and Iki, and surmised correctly that, to get there, the Mongols' most likely safe landing spot would be Hakata Bay. Enthusiastic defense preparations were made. Japanese records indicated that in the surrounding 9 provinces, horsemen gathered, each trying to outdo the other. Shoni Kagesuka, the younger brother of the Shugo, would take up defensive positions near the Hachiman Shrine. The Mongol plan was to move eastwards along the coast to Hakata, and then turn inland up the river to Dazaifu. Accounts state that the pace of the fighting was initiated by the Mongols. They disembarked from their ships, mounted their horses, raised their red war banners, and began their attack as they had on the previous 2 occasions. It was said that the Japanese grandson of one of the commanders loosed a single arrow to initiate combat per tradition. This was said to have been met with raucous laughter from the Mongols. They used tactics that were so unfamiliar to the Japanese, such as advancing on foot in large, dense groups protected by shields. The Japanese, meanwhile, had to this point generally fought more as individuals in those war bands, seeking out worthy opponents to accrue glorious accounts of individual prowess. The Mongols quickly secured the heights of the landing areas, where the generals gave commands to beat those war drums. These commands indicated whether troops should retreat in times of trouble or advance. The Mongols would also surround pre-arranged Japanese positions and use their explosive iron and paper balls strategically whenever they advanced or had to retreat. The Mongols pushed through the Japanese at the beach and towards Dazaifu, the Japanese preparing to make their last stand at Mizuki Castle, which was the lone buffer left between them and Dazaifu. The Mongols would arrive by dusk of that same landing day, having quickly moved inland. The defenders were under the command of Shoni Kagesuki. He managed to shoot a senior Mongol commander who was said to have been over 6.5 feet tall, or 1 meters, shooting him in the face and capturing his horse. There's speculation that the loss of all these commanders was the reason the Mongols did not push on to Dazaifu. The Mongols would instead retreat back to the beaches and the ships, but burning all in their path back, sparing no one. They were estimated to have lost 1/3 of their forces, though while this would be, from the Japanese point of view, most certainly a victory, we don't know exactly what the Mongol initial plan was. Perhaps it was a hit-and-run raid, meant to sow fear and force a capitulation. We've no records of Kublai Khan's reaction to the invasion or how much he knew. What we do know is that the next year, he again sent 2 envoys to Japan. The envoys, based on records, did not take the most direct route. Perhaps they had some glimpse of what fate awaited them, for they would take 2 months to arrive, and no sooner would they arrive with their great Khan's message than they would be beheaded. Nothing similar had been recorded occurring to the previous Mongol envoys to Japan. The Khan likely hoped that the Japanese were ready to capitulate before a second invasion attempt, but the message that they sent back via the beheadings was one that capitulation would not happen easily. When Kublai Khan finally received word about the disastrous first invasion, he would attempt to send troops to Korea to prepare for a second, but he would rescind the order, as this was when his armies were in their final push to the Song's southern capital, shown earlier. The Great Khan, therefore, must have realized focusing his eastern military efforts on the Song's capital was the more prudent plan. This would provide the Japanese with 7 years of intervening peace, but they would regardless make preparations for what they likely knew was a delayed but incoming storm. They would make preparations both of a physical defensive nature, but also based on their perceptions of events, religious ones as well. The physical preparations included the construction of a long defensive wall along the shore of Hakata Bay, its length close to 20 kilometers in its entirety, east to west. It was built in most places roughly 50 meters from the shore, and meant to hold the Mongols at bay to provide enough time for countermeasures. Those who displayed cowardice during the first invasion were dealt with, and heroes displaying valor and courage were rewarded. A new round of recruitment for samurai was also initiated in 1276, one that was irrespective of their vassal status. They had also planned to preemptively raid Korea, but did not end up committing the resources. They did not bolster the defenses on Iki or Tsushima, however, indicating their acceptance of both likely being overrun and their confidence being placed instead on the potential beachhead again at Hakata Bay. In 1277, they learned of the defeat of the Southern Song and must have known the Mongols would once again cast an eye towards their shores. In 1279, the Khan would send yet another last-ditch envoy attempt, but like their predecessors, they too were executed upon landing on Japanese shores. The following year, in 1280, he would summon a top-level conference at one of his summer palaces to discuss the strategy for the second invasion. Having learned lessons from the first, it was clear this one would be of a much larger scale. The wreckage of Mongol ships that were found contained farming implements on them, indicating the Mongols were prepared for a permanent, long-term occupation of Japan. Also different was that this attack would be two-pronged. One fleet from Korea as before, and a second this time from southern China. It's clear that these were still not always the best soldiers, as those were likely engaged elsewhere in the empire, as records show that prisoners were given commuted sentences to serve in the second invasion, and despite the contribution from southern China, Korea would again bear a disproportionate portion of the burden. While 600 warships were commissioned from the Chinese, the Koreans had to prepare 900. Again, troop estimates were prone to exaggeration and either under or overestimated, depending on which side tells the account. Best estimates are an army roughly 3 times the size of the Mongol force from 1274, and the Japanese also likely much larger than the defense force from the previous attempt. The order from the Khan to attack Japan was given on the first lunar month in the year 1281. The eastern assault from Korea would be carried out similarly to the first invasion. A Chinese fleet consisting of the south of the Yangtze force would sail across 768 kilometers of ocean to meet up with the eastern forces, and then combine near the island of Iki for a single massive attack. The Mongol military general Khan was given supreme command of the invading forces, and he would travel with the southern fleet. The eastern route Mongol army from Korea set sail on the 22nd of May, 1281, but took longer than the First Fleet in 1274 to arrive at Tsushima, arriving on the 9th of June without recorded reinforcement and resigned to the same fate of his late father. So Moriaki, son of Sukesada, would meet the overwhelming Mongol landing party and die. 300 islanders would be killed, and of these, some had taken children and women to hide in the mountains. But Mongol patrols found these too and slaughtered them. What forces the Japanese did have on the islands were on Iki, which the Mongols breached on the 14th of June. A Japanese army under the command of Shoni Suketoki and Yuzo Suketoki, said to have been in the low thousands, met the Mongols on the western Iki beaches, where they were routed and killed. The Mongols were to have waited for the southern army to arrive, but for some unrecorded reason, they did not, attacking both islands immediately instead. It's likely that spies from China provided intelligence on the wall defense at Hakata. Even after Iki, the Mongol Eastern Fleet did not wait for the south to join them, instead splitting their Eastern Fleet in two, one to attack Hakata, and the other to head east and attack Nagato at the tip of Honshu. This occurred on the 25th of June, but details are scarce. We do know that there's no recorded damage, only rumours that the fleet had been seen. The Eastern Fleet, half that was to land at Hakata Bay, did not have the anticipated element of surprise. The Japanese had, they not only stationed archers along the wall's length, but, departing from established practices, received explicit directives to fully cooperate. Any Mongol vessels attempting to land on the beaches were met with a barrage of arrows from archers strategically positioned behind the walls, where they were protected from return fire. While the Mongols likely didn't suffer extensive casualties, they opted to postpone their landing for the time being and instead seize control of the two Bay Islands, Shiga and Noko. Although Shiga Island was more accurately a peninsula connected to the mainland by a narrow strip of sandbar, the Japanese, however, weren't content to simply wait. They decided to take the offensive to the anchored Mongol ships. Their initial assault occurred on foot via the sandbar, but their most successful tactic involved using numerous smaller vessels to attack the much larger, ocean-going Mongol fleet. The sheer number of small ships effectively created makeshift bridges, allowing Japanese soldiers to board the Mongol vessels. Some samurai were even reported to have swum to the Mongol ships to attack. Successful boarding actions led to the taking of Mongol heads, which would be rewarded later. Ultimately, the success of these small ship raids proved to be the most significant factor in the Japanese defense against the invading forces. Finally, in July, during the 7th lunar month, the Southern Fleet arrived. Over the course of July, plans were developed, leading to a new target, Takashima Island, located roughly 50 kilometers west of Hakata Bay. On August the 12th, as the Mongol fleet approached Takashima, the Japanese small ship fleets were ready to engage them. Fighting broke out almost immediately and continued relentlessly throughout the night. While the specifics of the storms that supposedly aided the Japanese during the first invasion are questionable, definitive archaeological evidence supports the occurrence of a major storm during the second invasion, as the ship battles raged for days, with the Mongols unable to successfully land, and the Japanese likely struggling to gain ground in the open water. Neither side could achieve a clear advantage. Sometime later in August, midway through typhoon season, a powerful storm swept in. As it approached, its intensity increased dramatically. Reports indicate that ships near the shore collided with each other, breaking free or swinging wildly at the end of their anchor lines. Men were swept overboard and drowned, or were dashed against the nearby rocky shores. Those in deeper waters cut their anchors to try to ride out the storm. The sound of splintering wood must have been as deafening as the storm itself. Exact casualty figures are unavailable, but a Korean source states that of the 27 Korean soldiers sent on the eastern route, 500 did not return, indicating a casualty rate of approximately 30%. Interestingly, Chinese and Mongol sources suggest a casualty rate of 60 to 90%. This discrepancy may have been an attempt to save face, but that's speculation, as we lack definitive evidence. Those ships that managed to break free made their way back to China and Korea, abandoning any survivors who washed ashore to their fate. That fate being slaughter at the hands of the Japanese, who meticulously patrolled the shorelines and waters, killing any and all survivors. However, some sources claim that the Song Chinese, whom the Japanese believed were coerced into joining the attack, were spared, though their fate was to become slaves. Speculation about the discrepancy between the Korean and Mongol Chinese estimates continues to this day, with some believing that the Eastern Fleet was more battle-hardened. However, again, we have no definitive proof. A third invasion attempt was considered, but the Khan soon became embroiled in a series of frontier conflicts, and the invasion of Japan faded into history, but not in Japan itself. There, it became a source of national pride, and a kind of divine cult developed around the Kamikaze, which they called the Great Typhoon that struck the Mongol fleet. And that concludes the story of the Mongol invasions of Japan. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please hit that like button. If you haven't already and enjoy the content on this channel, consider subscribing. I'd love to have you on board. And as always, until the next video, cheers.